Bueno, agradecemos a Javier Aparicio estas palabras, sobre todo Javier Aparicio, que recuerda a los desmemoriados que la formación no es un gasto público. Y ahora sí empezamos estas sesiones profesionales del Fórum Edita, cuando son las 10:34 de este 3 de septiembre de 2020. Todo es en directo, así que permítanme que les anuncie que la pausa que había prevista en el programa para las 11 nos la vamos a saltar. Van a tener ustedes que tomar el café discretamente sin que les veamos, ahí al otro lado de la pantalla, para poder cuadrar el programa tal y como lo teníamos previsto. Así que nos ponemos en marcha. Les informo que las ponencias durarán alrededor de entre 15 y 20 minutos. Todos ustedes que nos están siguiendo, si lo desean, podrán hacer llegar sus preguntas a los ponentes a través de un email, del email que está aquí sobreimpreso en la parte inferior de la pantalla, preguntas@forumedita.com. Al final de cada intervención yo seleccionaré, en fin, las que dé tiempo para trasladarle sus cuestiones a los ponentes. Más cuestiones importantes. Algunas de las sesiones serán en inglés. La primera, precisamente, que vamos a realizar con Rüdiger Wischenbart. Ustedes pueden seguir la traducción clicando en el botón que tienen en la parte superior derecha de sus pantallas, donde pueden acceder a la traducción del inglés al castellano o del catalán al castellano. Así pues, empezamos con una puesta en situación del sector, con un primer bloque titulado Análisis de la situación y con una primera intervención titulada La aceleración de las tendencias de la pandemia, lo tienen ahí sobrescrito, a cargo de Rüdiger Wischenbart. Así que pues vamos a abrir la primera ventana internacional, vamos a abrir una ventana a Viena, donde está Rüdiger Wischenbart, uno de los expertos internacionales mejor informados del planeta libro. Él es fundador de la empresa Content and Consulting y fue durante varios años responsable de comunicación de la Feria del Libro de Frankfurt. Les recuerdo nuevamente que pueden enviar a Rüdiger Wischenbart sus preguntas a través de ese email que les decía anteriormente, el preguntas@forumedita.com. Vamos a ver si está preparado Rüdiger Wischenbart al otro lado de Europa. Vamos a ver. Hey, here you are. We are going to go to Vienna to say hello to Rüdiger Wischenbart. Welcome to this Foro Edita, Rüdiger, for the third year. You're a veteran.
Thank you very much, Antonio.
Okay.
I'm very pleased to be with you in Barcelona, even if physically I sit in Vienna in my office. But it's a very big pleasure. And as you said, it's the third time, so I believe that I'm part of your setup altogether. Let me switch to my screen, my presentation. I'm sorry. Good. So, hello everyone. What I want to try is to give you a bit of an overview how the current COVID-19 and lockdown and resulting consequences crisis, how that is impacting our industry. And I guess the best starting point is to mention a huge fragmentation of the world. Here we see a map produced by the Austrian Foreign Ministry of countries where there are travel warnings, but that's not the same map for every country. Everyone does their own thing, cutting up the world into new fragments and rearranging, redesigning how this world is put together, what is allowed, what is not allowed, etc. And I guess that fragmentation is the first and most important thing that we see, because we need to be fairly careful in asking what are our questions in the first place, because there are some very easy to do misunderstandings. COVID-19, for instance, is certainly not about anything in particular. It's about so many different things, from health to sanitary services to emotional strains to political and economic fallout. It is again, not a unifying force because it's universal, but it's not hitting everyone in the same ways. Think of affluent countries versus poor countries. Think of old people versus young people, big countries or small or cities versus small. So you have, again, a very, very complex situation of fragmentation. What COVID-19 is perhaps about, it's a primary condition. It's really impacting very fundamentally on how we live and interact. And it is accelerating transformations that were driving change already before it broke out. So when we go into the more detailed questions, we see again, it's a wide range of topics. Is it about books? Is it about how books are embedded into so many other media? We have all seen and heard the reports about ebooks, audiobooks rising. I mentioned the point of acceleration of trends that were here before. Suddenly, when lockdown started, people shifted from books to other media, but also at the same time, Patrici has mentioned that before, have increased their reading time. So it is, again, a very, very complicated, diverse set of factors that we may want to look at. But when we try to understand these different bits and pieces, again, a comparison with global maps portraying the sanitary crisis are helpful. Because here we have, like in the Johns Hopkins hospital and university in the US, a very, very powerful set of data available, produced on a daily basis that gives us a very clear and detailed and granular view on what is happening with regard to the corona developments. The question for us is, do we have something similar like a world map on publishing, perhaps not updated every day, but at least in more or less real time? And here we must very clearly say, no, we don't have any such world map on publishing. And that makes our job of understanding, of measuring, of analyzing, and of predicting what's the impact of COVID on our industry so complicated. So in today's menu, in this short presentation, I try to get done three things. Number one is a few more general observations. Second, I will introduce you to a case study on Germany, Austria, and Switzerland with really sales data pre, during, and post-lockdown, which illustrates a few of those trends that I started to emphasize, and then some preliminary projections with a particular focus on the question of big versus small. General observation. We all know that's a trivial statement to do, that the COVID-19 crisis has been like a black swan. The black swan is the unexpected, unforeseeable thing that is hitting everything, including books and reading, and that occurred at a very fragile moment already, because we know that most of the book markets, at least in Europe and in other parts of the world, with very few exceptions, have been shrinking. The media competition between books and other media has been on the rise, and we have not always a very clear understanding of these new competitions. We know that the book sector, in many parts, when the crisis now hit, had its first instinct to wall off and say, we are books, we are special, we need to build a wall to protect our book business, and we need to build a wall around reading as something very special. But in fact, that is perhaps a little bit naive, because, as I mentioned before, this is a very primary condition, and books and reading and publishing and authors and all this is a part of these primary things. The next thing is that there is so much that we just don't know. We lack many data, we lack an understanding about what is going to happen. The crisis has started half a year ago, and that seems like an age in the past. It's not something where we can make predictions very easily. And the big question, imminent question, I guess, is what will go on, what will happen in the fourth quarter of 2020 of this year? How will people behave, buying books or not buying books, reading more books or lesser books, when the Christmas season, the year-end sales are arriving? Everything that we have in data so far from the past 6 months is a little bit shaky by comparison to what we will see in the fourth quarter of that year. I want to make a focus, I said a case study, on one fairly small part of the book market, small in territory, in geography, and also in format. It's just focusing about digital publishing, ebooks and audiobooks in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. Why this? Because here I have access to some data provided by a big distributor, Bookwire, which is also active in Spain, as we know, and in Latin America. But Bookwire and I took sales data, real sales data for the past 6 months or so, and tried to make a very granular analysis, which is based on a methodology that we developed for the digital consumer book barometer over the past 3 years. You can access that COVID special that we did and the previous barometer reports at global-ebook.com. When we were looking into what we did is to cut and slice and dice sales data for ebooks and audiobooks, download sales, but also subscription sales, streaming, by various factors, by price, by units consumed, by different genre categories like juvenile, fiction, non-fiction, young adult literature, etc. We compared ebooks with audiobooks. We were looking into where were marketing campaigns, etc., etc. And what we saw was a lot of dynamics, partly very positive dynamics. And what we also discovered was that we had a number of very promising insights how publishers and retailers can woo their audiences very successfully by campaigns of marketing, of pricing, when they contextualize and really bear in mind who are the people that we want to address. And we see, and that makes the situation a little bit more complicated, we see by genre category, by topic, by format, ebooks are different than audiobooks. This has become a very complex environment. The basic news is that you have this high rise in the dotted line, which is highlighting the lockdown period in Germany and Austria. And we see that ebook sales, download sales, both in value, in euros earned and in volume, have been rising. They have been rising very dramatically during the COVID, falling off a little bit right afterwards, but the level before was lower than the level afterwards. So we see very clear indicators for a gain in the appreciation of electronic books. Lesson number one, it makes sense to understand what we see after lockdown, that digital in its various appearances is gaining strength and force. Second, the impact, if that was going up afterwards, or if it was going up and then a little bit down again, is very, very diverse and is depending on the genre category. We see, for instance, that the rise of fantasy and fiction was much more continuous in volume, while in other parts, for instance in education, where the children stayed at home, you had a peak very quickly, and then after the lockdown, people had consumed their load of educational materials for their children, and so the sales curve fell back down afterwards. But we also see on the very right side that individual campaigns, individual bestsellers are strong enough to really make a difference, and that's perhaps the most important lesson that publishers and retailers and everyone in the business of books must learn. When we are in a very particular situation, like under COVID-19 and lockdown conditions, we need to be much more savvy, much more smart in how we approach our audiences and how we segment our audiences, because not everyone does the same thing. And we must really look carefully, what are we doing and where are big growth events. We see here, for instance, that children and young adult literature had really dramatic gains before and during lockdown, doubling in some cases the volume and the revenue generated. But it takes a lot of efforts and a lot of professional entrepreneurship and targeted entrepreneurship by the business partners to make that last. The lesson is, it can make a positive impact, but it takes, in order to be sustainable, you really need to stick to what you are doing. And that is the blue background behind these columns. You see, whenever there is big marketing accompanying, coinciding with extraordinary events like the COVID crisis and the lockdown, then it makes an impact. And it makes a lot of sense to have that focus. That is perhaps my preferred chart, because it produces something that is, I guess, a surprise to many people. The red line shows you for Germany and Austria and Switzerland in audiobooks consumption, the sales, which went up very quickly when the lockdown started, but fell off very rapidly afterwards. It was not very sustainable. But when you look into flat subscription models, streaming, all these continuous, recurring relationships where people pay a few euros every month and have a load of content at their disposal to access, then suddenly you have a very sustainable growth curve. And that shows you that very new distribution and business models may gaining ground in the publishing industry. So the overall thing is, we have quite a few challenges to do good analysis, because the quality of the data that we have is very limited. Unfortunately, I must complain here for 1 second. Very few distributors and aggregators are willing to share data and to participate in collaborative efforts. We have seen this with our barometer experience, where for Spain, for instance, both Libranda and Bookwire, as the two main actors, have been willing to be positive, to help, to share data and participate. But that's the exception. In most other countries, we have just a few, a small part of the market where we can gain the data. And then we also have challenges because there are many new channels, non-traditional models, etc., that require to learn a lot in the analysis. The second challenge that we have to confront is, I mentioned it already, that the situation is complex because you have many formats, you have many channels, new channels and models of distribution and of business. But you discover when you dig into it that you have huge untapped potentials in different genre categories. Education, young adult, children are in digital more than underexplored so far, so there's a lot for publishers to gain. But it requires to tackle the complexity, and that requires experimentation, learning, pooling, working together, having collaboration partnerships with internal and with external partners. That results in a tricky difficulty, because the large organizations, they can set up an innovation department. They can put resources into that experimentation and learning. Smaller organizations, and they prevail in publishing, smaller organizations, both as publishers and as retailers, have a much more difficult situation to confront. So, to sum it up, in my understanding, COVID-19 is perhaps a very primary condition impacting everything on how we live and interact. And it's accelerating transformations that were driving change already before. Please do not expect a simple return to normal. That will not happen. Be open, learn and adapt. Analyze, diversify, take controlled risks, look twice, collaborate, and look at our reports. And we have also an upcoming conference, Reboot. Take a note of these two things. Download the global ebook website with the consumer book barometer, and take a look perhaps at rebootbooks.org. That will give you more of that kind of insights. Thank you very much for your attention. And now I just need to go back so that you can see me. Hello.
Rüdiger.
Thank you. Yes.
Rüdiger, thank you. I'm afraid we don't have more time. Next speaker, he has a train waiting for him. And I'm afraid I have to say you goodbye and thank you for your brilliant words, and thank you to be there in Austria, Rüdiger.
Thank you very much for having me.
Ciao, Rüdiger. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.